Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. It's my pleasure being here with you. For those who don't know me, my name is Mustafa Abedini-Fard. I'm an assistant professor of modern Persian literature and culture in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. I'd like to welcome you all to our flagship lecture this year, which also happens to be shortly after the Persian New Year. So for those of you who celebrate the Persian New Year, a belated Happy New Year to all of you, and a very belated Happy Nowruz. And also, it happens to be the event that concludes the 2023-2024 series of lectures. So it's really my pleasure. A little bit about the lecture series itself. This lecture series, the Alireza Ahmadian Lectures in Iranian and Persianate Studies, was named in memory of the late Alireza Ahmadian in 2019. He was an enthusiastic researcher, a consummate socio-political analyst, and an opinion leader on foreign policy who nurtured the virtues of diplomatic dialogue and liberal democracy. Alireza was a proud and devoted UBC alumnus, supporter of UBC's Department of Asian Studies, and a beloved member of Canadian Iranian community. And we are very grateful, of course, to Alireza's friends, family, and the wider community for their continued support of the Persian Studies program at UBC, and indeed, many members of the late Alireza Ahmadian family and also many of his friends are here today, and I would like to thank them so much for joining us in this event. This evening, we are honored to be welcoming Dr. Domenico Ingenito from UCLA. I'll leave the formal introduction to him and his works to my colleague later, Dr. Alexandra Hoffman. By the way, this event with Dr. Ingenito was supposed to be held last year. Unfortunately, we had to cancel it, but we're really thrilled to have him back with us now. Thank you, Domenico John. Speaking of Dr. Hoffman Aziz, I would love to actually introduce her to those of you, especially who have not had a chance yet to meet her or don't know her. I am delighted to introduce her. Alexandra joined us as our newly hired assistant professor in classical Persian literature and culture last year, in July, to be more accurate. Dr. Hoffman's research interests span a wide range of topics within Persian literature, including gender and sexuality, the history of emotions, and race and ethnicity. Her scholarly pursuits hold the promise of illuminating new facets of pre-modern Persianate literature and Perso-Islamic culture. Before I end, I would also like to say that I'm really delighted to see that our closest colleagues in the Persian program, Dr. Navina Naqvi, Dr. Hesam Dehqani, and Ms. Mahtab Sirdani have also honored us with their presence today. I really cannot end by giving a huge khasta nabashid and big thank you to Dr. Dehqani, especially and also recently Ms. Sirdani for doing a one-of-a-kind job, I would say, with our Persian language and culture program. Thank you, all of you, also for being here. And without further ado, I invite Dean Crouston to share with us an overview of the journey of our program over the years, as well as also some insights about the future of our initiative at UBC. Thank you.
سلام، خیلی خوش آمدید. من کلر کروستن، دین فاکولتی of Arts هستم. خیلی ممنون که امشب آمدید. Hello everyone, my name is Claire Croston, Dean of the Faculty of Arts. It's wonderful to be with you this evening, and also I guess a belated Eid Shoma Mubarak to everybody. It's great to be with you so close to the New Year celebration. It's a huge honor to be here with you tonight introducing this event as part of the wonderful lecture series. Last time I spoke in front of this community, and I know many of you were there that evening, it was to welcome Professor Alexandra Hoffman to her new role as assistant professor in classical Persian literature and culture. And those of you who were with us that evening will well remember the wonderful talk she gave, which was really inspiring to many people who were in the audience. And not to mention her Persian is just remarkable and really impressive. And as you were just hearing from Mustafa, Alexandra is the newest recruit to a growing program of faculty in Persianate and Persian and Iranian studies at the University of British Columbia. And very quickly over the last, I know that for people in the community who have been eager and enthusiastic for us to move forward, it doesn't seem like it's happened overnight, but in the what we think of as academic time, which is a lot slower moving, I think, than other kinds of time. Thank you for bearing with us. In what for us is really a short decade, we now have one of the strongest programs in this area in North America, probably the world. And so we have at least 4 tenure track professors, as well as people helping us with the Persian language teaching. So it's now possible for students, young people in your community, maybe your children or your friends' children, grandchildren, to be able to come to UBC and study Persian language, both introductory and advanced level, which is wonderful for our heritage language speakers, but also for, we have plenty of newcomers, as I think Hessam could testify, people who did not grow up being exposed to Persian, but who are very excited to have access to this wonderful culture through its language. And we also, as you've heard now with Mustafa's professor of modern Persian literature and with Alexandra in classical Persian literature, we really span a tremendous chronological arc of culture and literature from Iran and the Persianate world. And this is a wonderful thing to be able to offer to our students. And it's really, I think, important in this world, which is ever more complex, in which global issues, including in the Middle East, become more challenging every year. It's really important that this rich culture of Iran be known to the world. And it's a culture that I don't have to tell the people here, goes back many centuries, even millennia. My husband, who's Iranian, likes to remind me of all the inventions of Persian culture, ranging from mathematics to democracy to chess, polo. Every important thing, it seems, that we value in world culture comes from Iran. And I just sent him a little snippet from the media. I don't know if you've seen this recent news that the first big place of settlement when humanity left its origins in Africa was in the Persian plateau. So now we know that not only democracy and mathematics, but humanity itself, in many ways, has a birth. It's an originary birth in Persia, which I'm sure does not come as a surprise to people gathered here today. And we're very, very proud at UBC to be involved in not just disseminating knowledge of the Persian language and Persian culture, but also in creating knowledge. And so our scholars that have joined us are doing amazing work creating new knowledge about this rich historical culture and sharing it with the world. And so tonight's event, the Alireza Ahmadian Lecture in Iranian and Persianate Studies, is a pillar of this program. And as you know, and as Mustafa was just mentioning, Alireza, who I did not have the privilege to know, sadly, but he was a passionate supporter and advocate of this program. He helped establish Persian language and Iranian studies in the Department of Asian Studies, where he was an enthusiastic and high-achieving undergraduate student. And we're extremely grateful to the family of Alireza to have endowed this lecture series in his memory and his honor, and also to his friends for supporting us and for coming out for the lecture. And as we are about to be reminded by tonight's talk, for many years this lecture has really been a highlight of not just our program, but of scholarship in this area, bringing together people such as yourself to hear about the latest developments in studies on Iran and the Persianate world. And just looking forward, for me as dean, some of you may know, this is maybe my 15th month here in Vancouver and at UBC, and it's a great delight for me to have arrived at a moment when many years of work on this program are really coming to fruition, and we see the momentum gathering and accelerating. And so in terms of what's coming next, I'm committed as dean to supporting this program. I'm very excited by it, personally invested in it, and really delighted by the quality of the students and the faculty that we have here. One area that those of you who were here at Alexandra's talk have heard me mention is what we have heard from colleagues in the library, that they are eager and excited to support this program. Currently, there is no staff in our amazing, huge UBC research library who have the language capacity to handle works in Persian. And so this is an issue really for students who want to pursue their studies. Also, we need to support the research advances of our faculty. They need to be able to work with material. And I know that some of you have collections of really valuable, precious works that you might be interested in sharing with our library eventually. And that's another challenge for us to be able to handle this material without staff. And so that's one area that our conversations with the community are focusing on right now. Not that we don't want to grow our faculty or that we don't want to continue to grow events like tonight's exciting event, but for us to really have a strong foundation for moving this program forward, it's really important for us to be able to bolster the library and to make it possible for the library to work with the materials and to support our students and scholars. So let me just end. I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to, Mustafa cued me to talk about past and future. I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to members of the Persian community here in Vancouver and elsewhere, whose generosity has made possible the creation of the Professorship in Classical Persian Literature and Culture and the Alireza Ahmadian Lecture Series. And so thank you to those of you in the community who have been so generous with us, who have been such enthusiastic supporters of UBC. I'm looking forward to getting to know you all better as the months and years go by. And I'm also, as I'm sure you are, very much looking forward to tonight's lecture. So let me turn things over to Alexandra to introduce our guest. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Croston, and also to Mustafa for your very kind words for me. I really appreciate the extremely warm welcome that I have experienced here at UBC. Before we head into the introduction of the speaker and the lecture, I just wanted to share a brief thank you for all the people that have helped in the organization of this event, together with me and Mustafa. The behind-the-scenes team of Lisa, Winnie, Zoe, Farima, Marjan, and of course our poster designer, Razman. Thank you so much for your work. It would not have been possible without you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Domenico Ingenito, who is an associate professor of Iranian studies and pre-modern Persian literature at the University of California at Los Angeles, as well as a lifelong Bahari Fellow in the Persian arts and of the book at the Bodleian Libraries at Oxford. He is the core faculty member of the Pur Dawood Center for the Study of the Iranian World and a former director of the UCLA program on Central Asia from 2016 to 2021. Dr. Ingenito's research interests center on ancient and medieval Iran, Persian poetry, visual culture of Iran and Central Asia, gender and translation studies, and pre-modern manuscript culture. He has published his wonderfully hefty monograph on Saadi in 2020 under the title Beholding Beauty, Saadi of Shiraz and the Aesthetics of Desire in Medieval Persian Poetry. And most recently, he has published an Italian translation of Forugh Farrokhzad's collected poems, along with a critical edition of her poems in Persian. So today, we really have the extraordinary pleasure to hear a talk about his research on both Jahan Malek Khatun and Forugh Farrokhzad. I'm looking forward to it immensely, so please join me in welcoming warmly Dr. Ingenito today.
Thank you for your generous introduction. Thank you for hosting me here. I'm very moved by your kindness, by your intellectual affection. And Vancouver is one of my favorite cities in North America. And I'm very honored to be here today, to be part of what is becoming actually one of the most important programs in the field of Persian literary studies in North America and in the world. Absolutely. So please bear with me, I'm having a hard time containing my emotion in this moment. I'm here today to talk about and also facilitate a conversation between these two women, Jahan Malek Khatun and Forugh Farrokhzad, who did not happen to know about each other. Of course, they were living in different time periods. And the modern poet Farrokhzad was not aware of Jahan's poetry. So for me, this is an opportunity to facilitate a conversation, right, between two of the most interesting characters of Persian literature and world literature from a certain point of view. And I'm here also to initiate a conversation that spans across different centuries and centers around the meaning of creating poetry and the meaning of valuing female voices, right, in the context of world literature. I will start with a passage by Forugh Farrokhzad. Most of you probably know about her. I will dwell later about her biography. I will share a very short biographical sketch. But now I want to open with this short passage that she published in 1955. And it's an afterword to her first collection of poetry, Asir, Prisoner. Forugh Farrokhzad says, I always ask myself why the melody of my poetry sounds so unfamiliar to your ears, and why some cannot easily digest it. Maybe because I am accused of contributing with my poetry to the spread of corruption. Shouldn't a woman be able to express her genuine and inner feelings about anything when she wants to compose poetry? If I write a poem about another woman's tall stature, eyes, and eyebrows, would I have expressed my feelings, and would my verses attract readers? For people in the West, this issue is outdated. But in our country, Iran, it is received with a sense of astonishment and even disdain. We have several questions here, right, at work. There's so much at stake. What does it mean to write poetry as a woman? What does it mean to defend oneself as a woman poet and writer? What does it mean to talk about our innermost feelings from the perspective of our biological sex, but also from the perspective of our gender? What is the relationship between poetry and desire? Can we talk about desire? What is the connection between the expression, the poetic expression of desire, and morals, ethics, akhlaq, right? What is at stake here? There's a lot. What happens when a young woman like Forugh Farrokhzad, she was 20 years old at the time, decides to express publicly in verse her passion for life, her love for beauty, and also sensual desire. Years later, she publishes what was considered the manifesto of Persian poetic modernism, Tavallud-i Digar, Another Birth. And you will see now how that young woman developed her personal voice up to the point of writing lines of such strength, such as, "In this wicked land of wonders, my beloved, Ma'shuq man, is a simple human being, a simple being that I want to hide inside the forest of my breast, ultimate sign of enchanting religion." And here, between the very first passage and these lines, I'm trying to show you the arc of this experience that this poet had in Iran between the 50s and 60s. But I will return to her later, because I want to focus now on the other wonderful woman poet I'm introducing to you tonight. And probably most of you never heard her name. Some of you might be familiar with this name, Jahan Malek Khatun, who flourished in Shiraz during the second half of the 14th century. Yes, the same Shiraz and the same century, the same decades when Hafez Shirazi was active. They probably knew each other. They responded to each other. They had istiqbal and jawab. They would compose poetry, paying homage to each other's lines and verses. And she has left us one of the most extraordinary collections of poems in the history of Persian literature, a divan of more than 1,400 ghazals. Right? In Hafez divan, we find only between 400 and 500 ghazals. Right? In Sadi has 600, 700 ghazals. She has 1,400 ghazals. She's probably the most important woman poet of medieval Iran and of probably medieval Islam. So I think that she's probably the most interesting voice in the context of medieval Islamic culture in terms of women poets. And yet she's not really extensively translated. She's not very well known. She's not really known in Iran. Only specialists of the sector are familiar with her poetry. And I really hope that the more we talk about these experiences, the more we talk about these authors, and the more there will be public interest in collecting their voices and spreading also what they had to say. Her poetry is extremely important, of course. Apologize. But another interesting aspect of what she left in the few manuscripts that survive, collecting her divan, is an introduction in which she explains why she decided to write poetry. So she explains for her readers what it feels like to write poetry as a woman in medieval Iran. And I'm not a specialist of modern Persian poetry. I'm a specialist of medieval Iran. And when I started working on Forugh Farrokhzad, I saw that there are so many points of contact between these two women. And it's so interesting to, as a medievalist, I always assumed that the modern period has nothing to do with the medieval period. There's not much continuity, but seeing that women can come to the same questions in different times, even despite of the time difference right between them. And the responses, of course, are very different. So I thought that we could start this conversation together and see how they are talking to each other without ever even talking to each other, really. In introduction to her divan, she opens with this astounding, beautiful praise of human language. And she says, "May the Creator be exalted. He ennobled human beings by bestowing upon them the honor of language, eloquence, and the perfect mastery of speech. He is the Almighty who converted the earthly natured Adam into the object of worship for the angels holding the divine throne. He is the painter who depicted the virgin images of human thought upon the primordial pages of the hearts. It is the divine presence whose powerful hand shaped the image of the soul in the most beautiful form. He is the all-knowing one who, through the power of speech, converted a chunk of flesh into the treasury where the mysteries of science are found." These are powerful, powerful words that if we compare, we don't have time to do this now, but if you compare this opening of her divan, this is her praise of God, with other praises of God that we find in other medieval collections of poetry, we can perceive that there's something personal here. There's a personal connection with the art of poetry, composition, and language. There is a sophistication, of course, but there is some sort of intimate relationship with the problem, philosophical problem, theological problem of producing language in verse and in poetry. She was a princess. She was the daughter of the brother of the ruler of Shiraz during the first few decades of the 14th century, the Ingenito family. She was the daughter of, she was the niece of Abu Ishaq, Ingenito. And she reveals her presence as a woman. She's not afraid of declaring herself as a woman poet. So she specifies what her biography is, what her genealogy is, and she also specifies that she's not having a good time because another ruling family takes over Shiraz in the years in which she was started to become known as a poet, and she had to live in this troubling moment of political hardship in the city of Shiraz, and she had to face also the resistance of her fellow male poets or other poets who were not accepting the presence of a woman. One of the first women who had the courage of writing poetry and disseminating her poetry in the public arena. And I'm sharing with you here what her detractors, male detractors, would say about her during that time. So these are historical documents showing how she was perceived. Obed Zakani, probably you heard his name, or maybe Kamal Khujan, in one poem says, if one day the poemist Jahan were to reach India, the soul of Khosrow would tell Hassan these were composed by a vagina. The original Persian is much more vulgar than what I'm translating here. In another line, yes, it's the kaf word. Jahan Malek Khatun is a whore and their poetry is a prostitute too. All friends enjoy instead more refined poems composed by men. So this is what she had to face. So she thought that in her introduction, she had to defend herself and explain what the meaning of her poetry is and what the value of her poetry is in a way that is very similar, so close to what 6 centuries later, Forugh Farrokhzad had to specify at a very young age when publishing her first collection of poetry. We'll see these correspondences. She starts describing her creative process as a spiritual process, the spiritual origins of erotic poetry. She writes ghazals, which is poems of love, but she says, she specifies that her inspiration comes from the invisible, alam-e-ghaib. She says, for every form that appeared, multiple thoughts surfaced in my mind. For the entertainment of my spirit and despite all the afflictions caused by the painful cycle of days and nights, I occasionally composed poetic fragments that were as desperate as the feelings of lovers, as troubled as the hearts consumed by passion, as broken and scattered as the heart of the masters of gazes, as unfulfilled as the wishes of the masters of desire. By composing such verses, I craft a spiritual reality, haqiqat, in the garb of mundane metaphors, majaz, and thus I appeased the burning sorrow of the days with the refreshing water of the poetic description of my emotions. So we have spiritual training, riyazat, spiritual contemplation, meditation on the invisible, on the spiritual essences of the angels, getting closer to God through these Sufi practices, and extracting meaning through this spiritual practice that can be converted into erotic poetry. So she's not talking about experience, she's talking about the connection that she feels with the invisible and how this connection can be best translated through language in erotic verse, in amatory verse, in ghazal. And expressing this Vasfal Hali, this poetic experience of it is almost biographical. But of course, there were detractors, and she says that in all this, in spite of some people, like Obed Zakani in a way, or Kamal Khojandi, who absolutely deprived of any sacred flame, himmat, or lotfi aspiration, would dwell on the surface of those forms and consider despicable the mundane reflection of such marvels. In fact, because of the weakness of their gaze, they could not lift the veil from the object of their contemplation. Not all gazes can dare to stare at the sun, not all raindrops know how to become one with the ocean. This is, if you're familiar with Rumi, Maulana Rumi, you will recognize echoes, right, of this idea of connecting with the invisible and going beyond the appearance, the surface of reality in order to connect with the ghaib, with the unseen, with the spiritual world, with malakut also. But here there is a very strong connection with the value of eroticism and something that should not be denied. What is important, though, is to read eroticism as a ladder leading, as a bridge leading to the invisible. And so keeping together these two aspects of the erotic, the physical, and the metaphysical. And she says that it's important to do so. And she says that her poetry should not be criticized because of its erotic content, because the meaning of it takes readers somewhere else. And in fact, she says, but to all the scholars who are able to penetrate truth and ponder its intricacies, it is clear that the ultimate purpose of speech is not its external meaning, but rather the comprehension of mysteries. Poetic expression of metaphors is the main vehicle to grasp and describe the ultimate truths of the soul. And it is for this reason that they state that figurative speech, majaz, is a bridge toward the truth. This is so interesting. This sentence in Arabic is al-majaz qantaratul haqiqati. It means, right, it's used originally in Arabo-Persian treatises on poetics to talk about metaphors, to talk about similes. For instance, if I say this woman's face is as beautiful as a rose, I'm using a majaz, a rose, like as a metaphor, as a simile, in order to get to the truth of the beauty of the face that I'm describing, that the haqiqat. This is the way that this sentence was used in medieval treatises on poetics. I think she's the first one, as far as I know, in the literary tradition of medieval Iran, who applies this sentence that is originally about linguistics and poetics to spirituality. What he's trying to say is, and I wrote a whole book about this, Beholding Beauty deals with this thing, that it was initiated by Saadi Shirazi 1 century earlier. Whatever form of beauty we see in the world is a shahed, is an attestation to divine beauty. And the more we get ourselves familiar with mundane beauty, the more we can access the mysteries of divine beauty, right? So this majaz becomes a bridge toward the invisible world. And she brings together these reflection meditations on poetics with the concurrent conversations on the connection between spirituality and the physical appreciation of the world. But there's a problem. Can I, Jahan Malek Khatun, as a woman, circulate my poetry? Can I recite my poetry in public? She says, given that very few respectable Persian women are known to have practiced the art of poetry, I too decided to accept this stance and assume that any renowned literary practice ought to be frowned upon. Therefore, I grew wary of it and refrained from circulating my verses. And then she pauses for a second. She says, well, actually, I can mention a few names. Prophet Muhammad's daughter composed poetry in Arabic. There are some poets who composed poetry in Arabic before me. And then she starts mentioning other women who came before her who did circulate some poetry. And so she relies on this tradition in order to find her own space in this poetic canon. So it's thanks to the tradition that she allows herself, right, to emerge and to be known and to circulate a poem and to respond also to someone like Hafez. Has anyone been to Shiraz here in the audience? Are you? Wonderful. Have you been to the Hafezieh? Right? If you go to the Hafezieh, there's a beautiful ghazal by Hafez. Mojdeh wasl toku ka sar jan barkhizam, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful poem that is engraved on Hafez's tomb. I'm saying that it's a response to Hafez, but it's possible that Hafez was responding to her. We can discuss this. And she has this beautiful response in which the refrain of barkhizam is converted into barkhizad. And I have here a translation and the original text. She says, Pish ruye to delam az sar jan barkhizad. Jan che bashad ze sar har do jahan barkhizad. Before your face, from my soul, my heart will arise, but the soul is nothing. From both worlds, my heart will arise. Should you step on the soil where the inflamed lovers were buried, shouting and dancing from their graves, they will arise. A shirt is the only veil now between you and me. Hold me tight, this veil too at last will arise. Hafez's poem, the original poem is very, very spiritual, very mystical. She's converting that mystical imagery into something that's very sensual in a very beautiful way. For how long my tormented destiny has been asleep, it is now time for it to wake up. It will arise. So much the violence of your departure afflicts the world. Her name, Jahan, means world. It's interesting. She introduced her signature in many lines in her ghazals. That I fear turbulent seditions from these times will arise. The juniper's feet would get stuck in the mud when dancing in the garden like a cypress, your body will arise. No farewell to your embrace until the last breath of my body. I will keep you mine, even if suddenly my hopes for life arise. Sedition arises when that red rose sits down, the cypress tree sits down, when that walking cypress is set to arise. If only one whisper for Jahan's griefs should come out, oh, the cries from the old and young will arise. We know that in medieval Persian poetry, gender and desire, the connection between gender and desire, is not related to biography. Poets can describe an ideal object of desire regardless of actual experience. We know for a fact at this point that in the tradition of love poetry, lyric poetry ghazal, the object of desire is usually a young man, right? There's this intergenerational, customary homoerotic discourse, right? So it's a trend, right? All poets do this, regardless of their actual sort of sentimental or romantic or sexual attraction toward women or men. It's not a matter, it does not describe what their actual desires are, but it's customary for several reasons. We can discuss this, going back to the very origins of Persian poetry and the connection between Iranians and Turks in Central Asia. But there is a trend. Jahan Malek Khatun understands that in order for her to be accepted as a Persian poet, she needs to adopt the homoerotic discourse that was staged by her fellow male poets. And so for this reason, even though she does not hide her gender as a woman, she pretends to be a man in love with a young man in her ghazals as well. In her poems, we find so many instances in which she pretends to be a male figure in love with a female figure or with a male figure at the same time, right? So there's this very interesting way of, she plays with the tradition. She plays with gender. I go back to Judith Butler and the idea of gender as a construction, gender as a performance. So there is this performative, the performativity, right, of gender construction and desire that is a play in her poetry. Right? She says, you're Layli, you're the cure for my pain. I am Majnun, I am the wandering madman. So she goes back to the tradition of stories narrated by Nezami. Professor Hoffman is a specialist on Nezami. We'll have a conversation about this later, hopefully. You are Shirin, seated in the time of Khosrow Parviz. I am Farhad, the mountain hacker. My sweet soul has expired. You are Shirin, you are as sweet as the soul in my body. I am Khosrow, King Khosrow. I am Khosrow, preoccupied with the night of separation. You are Azra. I am preoccupied with the pain of your love. I am Vamek, provide a cure for my pain. You are Gulshah, you are rose-scented just like the moon. I am Varga, I am drowning in the endless ocean of separation. You are the rose-limbed Vis, because of your soul I am snared in the trap. I am Ramin, the hem whose heart burns in grieving for you. From my soul I sing the praise of the eternal world ruler, who from his kindness has given me cares and the soul and faith. She compares herself to Alexander, Iskandar. I am Alexander in search of the water of life. I dwell amidst the darkness of your hair, enraptured by strife. And then she talks about the historical love, amateur relationship between Ayaz and Mahmud. Mahmud, the Ghaznavid Sultan, who was in love with one of his slaves, who became one of his commanders of the army. It is true that the beautiful Ayaz was Mahmud's slave, but I am Ayaz with no Mahmud, no conclave. She compares herself to the wolf who wanted to capture Joseph, the mythical wolf, because we know that Joseph's brothers were pretending, right, that Yusuf had been killed by a wolf. Joseph's lips never fulfilled my desires. I became like the wolf. My lips stained with blood, and my mouth is empty. She says, she refers to herself as a man. I've never been a man worthy of your love. What can I do? I have no choice but falling in love with your face. I never was a man worthy of this love. But how different is a man from a true man? So you can see how there's this interesting, almost playful way of reenacting gender, and also rely on the fact that Jahan, in Persian, nouns don't have a grammatical gender, but Jahan in medieval Persian has feminine connotations. It's usually referred to the world as a female, beautiful bride who betrays all of her lovers. And she plays with that too. She says, every man who ever went through hardship and troubles, beware, it was for sure a result of women's actions. Please don't be unfaithful like women, love affairs belong to men. So she enacts also the misogynistic imagery of the tradition. She says, you might blame Jahan by saying deceitful is her love, but listen, does anyone expect loyalty and affection from the world, Jahan? So she plays also with the meaning of world as an actual world, as a female deceitful presence, and her own pen name, her own takhallos of Jahan. So this is why I look at her strategy as something that is quite interesting, because she adopts, on the one hand, she presents herself as a woman. On the other hand, she adopts the homoerotic voice of the tradition. And then she constantly subverts this order of things. So her femininity becomes something that is in flux, a fluid presence, right? So playing, using her name, putting the word Jahan as a pun in every other verse in some ghazals, and then using the word, comparing herself to a female presence, and then to a male presence. So we see all these aspects that are confusing her spectators, her readers. And thanks to this confusion, thanks to this subversion, she managed to become a famous poet. And poets after her, biographers, described her poetry. Daulat Shah Samarkandi, 1 century later, praises her poetry in a very interesting way, and we are here today in Vancouver talking about her. So it was a successful strategy in a way. Let's see what happens when we think about modern poetry while bearing in mind the strategies the medieval poet was adopting. And I apologize, I'm embarrassed to show the image of my book, but I'm very proud of this publication because I started teaching myself Persian in Italy, where I grew up, reading Forugh Farrokhzad's poetry and trying to translate. I published a small booklet of a selection of her poems with a local press, and then years later, about 10 years ago, a major Italian publisher, Bompiani, asked me whether I wanted to publish the original text in Persian, which is a huge thing in Italy to do. It's very bold of a publisher to do that, along with the Italian translation of all the works. And when I was a student of Persian, I realized that her poetry is censored in Iran. You cannot find Forugh Farrokhzad's uncensored poetry in Iran. It's published, right, but it's always censored. And it's very hard also to find the original editions of her poems. I found them in the Doneshgah Tehran, in the library of the University of Tehran, for instance. And I decided to create a critical edition, to publish a critical edition, so that readers around the world could. So for me, it was a way to thank Iranian cultures, all Iranians, right, for all the intellectual affections I've received in my life, right. And so I decided to publish all of their works, and there is a critical introduction. There are 5 collections of poetry: Asir, Prisoner, Divar, Osyan, Tavrod Digar, Imam Biavarim Be'Aghaz Fasl Sar, which was posthumously published. And some lines extracted from her movie, Khane Siyah Hast, some poems that she composed with Yadollah Royai, who's also a wonderful modernist poet, poems attributed to her, and an appendix. Iconic woman, She died very early. She was born in 1934. She died in 1967, only 32, 33 years old. She's the most important woman poet of modern Iran. She's the first poet who talks about sex in poetry, in the Persian tradition, in a quite explicit way. There are many firsts with her. She marries very young because she wanted to. At 14, 15, she decided to marry a distant relative. And she moves from Tehran to Hafez in southern Iran. And it's a very brief career as a poet, but extremely intense. She suffers from depression. She attempts suicide several times. She has a child. She separates from her husband. She has to face the humiliation and the pain of electroshock therapy in a psychiatric institute. She meets the love of her life, Ibrahim Golestan, who's an important filmmaker and producer. She starts learning Italian and German. She translates from German into Persian. She makes this beautiful short movie, Khane Siyah, The House is Black. She adopts a child from the leper colony where she was filming the movie. She wins prizes at festivals. She travels to Europe, and then she dies in a car crash, right? That's at only 32. What a life. She's becoming now a little sort of a literary case in Italy. Italians are discovering non-Western poetry. I'm glad that I could contribute in a way to this. This is the front cover of Italy's most important poetry magazine, Poesia. Why is Farrokhzad so important when we compare her poetry to Jahan Malek Khatun's? As I was saying earlier, in classical and post-classical Persian poetry, lyric poetry is a fictive abstraction that represents reality as an aesthetic ideal rather than a subjective experience. Takhil, make believe. I write poetry to impress my audience. I'm not talking about an experience. I'm here creating a craft. It can be spiritual, can be political, can be personal, but I'm not drawing upon my own experience. And there is this normative homoeroticism, like Jahan Malek Khatun. She was adopting this normative homoerotic expression of desire. There is an abstract male lover, the Ashek, doesn't have a name, who addresses an idealized male beloved, Ma'shuk, also doesn't really have a name. Becoming modern in Iran meant to convert these traditional homoerotic trends into heteronormativity. Intellectuals like Bahar, like Khanlari, for instance, were insisting on the fact that our country, in order to modernize, and there are many scholars who wrote about this. There's Muhammad Tabakoli, there's Janet Afari, Afsaneh Najmabadi. They all wrote extensively about this process of heteronormalization of the literary canon and the culture, right? So also through the influence of European models, aesthetic models. So with the emergence of literary modernism during the first half of the 20th century, heteronormativity also is a process of lyric modernization. So there are poets like Bahar, like Nima, Feridun Tavallali, Shamlu, Nader Naderpur, who start talking about real women. So not only the women that are portrayed in this, the object of desire is portrayed in these poems, starting in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, is a real object of desire, but is a female presence that emerges for the first time through the history of Persian lyric poetry. Farrokhzad has a problem. She understands that modernist poetry is a poetry that should stem from one's heart and from one experience, so it should sound real as opposed to the fiction of the medieval canon. But she has a problem. She said, how can I write poetry if I don't have the language, if there is no language available for this? Because there is always a man praising a woman, or a man praising a young man, right, in the pre-modern canon. So for her, the question is, how can I create a true poetic experience if I am a woman in a context in which there are no other female poets who are talking about sexual desire? And so she publishes this scandalous poem in an article titled Sho'er Bi Parva, the Impudent Poet, Roshan Fakr, magazine, 1954. And she published this short lyric called Gonah, the sin. She's married, she has a child, but she's confessing an erotic encounter with a non-mahram, right? With another person who is not her husband. And the poem says, گناه کردم گناهی پر ز لذت در آغوشی که گرم و آتشین بود گناه کردم میان بزبانی که داغ و کینه‌جوی و آهنین بود. I sinned a sin replete with pleasure in a hot embrace that set me on fire. I sinned while held by vengeful arms, resentful arms of steel blaze. In the darkest, quietest place, I stared into the mystery of his eyes. My heart was quivering inside my chest, elated by his eyes' lustful demands. In the darkest, quietest place, I sat by him, unsettled. His lips then poured desire into my lips. My heart was freed from the craze of angst. I whispered words of love into his ears. I want you, oh sweetheart. I want you, oh soulful embrace. You, maddened by love, are all I want. Desire kindled flames across his gaze, scarlet wine dancing inside the cup. Amidst the softness of our bed, my limbs were drunkenly shaking atop his chest. I sinned replete with pleasure next to a body entranced by passion. My God, how will I know what I did in that darkest, quietest place? She decides to subvert the canon. For the first time, it's a female voice that is talking about sex in the context that is not marital love. It's talking about pleasure. And the female presence is also physically towering upon the male presence. This was an absolute first time. Readers from all over Iran started calling the headquarters of the magazine. There was probably a fatwa issued in Qom complaining about what had happened. She was shocked by this reaction. She fell into depression. And months later, when she published her first collection, they asked her not to publish this poem. And she decided to write an afterword in which she describes, she explains what it meant for her to talk about desire from the perspective of a woman, and what it meant to write in a way that felt realistic. That was not just a fiction. It was not just sort of repeating the tekrar mukarrarat, right? The usual idealized depictions of love that were typical of the classical canon. So she published Asir, Prisoner, illustrations by Mohammad Bahrami, who unfortunately died only a year ago, a wonderful illustrator. The book was republished in 1956 and then 1963. Beautiful illustrations. And she's very clear about her mission. She said, in the face of the flood of accusations and critiques that I have long been directed at me from every side, I wanted to find an opportunity to clarify and defend the path I have decided to take and the goal I want to pursue. Those who read my writings should understand that this defense is solely in support of the goal I pursue, and in no way am I trying to defend the value of my personal artistic accomplishments. I say this for those who seek their reputation in defaming others and, by digging inappropriately in one's private life, try to find a weakness to exploit and attack them. I want to tell these people that my existence, my name, my life, and in general, anything directly related to me is absolutely worthless when compared to my vision and goal. And perhaps the resilience I have shown so far against all this pressure is the best proof of the steadfastness of my faith. My friends ask me, faith in what? And moving towards which goal? And I constantly remind myself that only through the power of perseverance will I be able to free my condition from the rotten constraints that bind artistic practice and eventually assert for everyone, and especially for women, the right to freely reveal their hidden emotions and fleeting feelings without any fear or anxiety to be rebuked by other people. When I flip through magazines and consult poetry books left by both ancient and contemporary poets, when I delve into their lines, I see that men have spoken of love and their beloved with utmost clarity and freedom. likening her to anything they want, expressing all sorts of desires through the imaginative language of poetry, and expressing all the romantic vicissitudes they have experienced with her. People have read these books in utmost tranquility, and no one ever cries out, the foundations of morality are shaking, public chastity and piety are collapsing, and publishing this book leads to the moral degradation of the youth. This is very similar to what people were telling about Jahan's poetry at the time, in a way, right? You see that 6 centuries earlier. It is true that Farrokhzad describes romantic affairs with other men in her poetry. My theory is that we should look at this not as sins, but as her freedom to find new experience that could create for her language as a performance in order to reinvent the traditional Greek poetry, erotic poetry in Iran. So in a way, it's a tragic destiny, and she had to pay for it, of course. But for her, love-making, erotic interactions with other men were the language for her to recraft poetry and to create opportunities for her to reinvent the canon. It's a very radical choice, which I compare. Usually, her poetry is compared to the poetry of Sylvia Plath, for instance, in the Anglo-Saxon world. But I prefer to look at her in comparison to Nan Goldin, for instance, to Cindy Sherman, to other performers and photographers who display this constant blending between life and art. Shirin Neshat, even, was the early stage of Shirin Neshat's video art, for instance. So I look at her poetry as a constant act of rebellious performance, rather than the juvenile expression of desire. This is the way that, unfortunately, most critics read her poetry. And her first collections are not studied, are not translated, because they're seen as this very easy, turbulent examples of easy description of biographical experiences. What if we give credit to the power of this poetry, and we look at it as performance rather than solely poetry? And then she said, but when a woman picks up the pen and claims the right for herself to say what she feels, meaning to reflect her feminine spirit in poetry, suddenly the pillars of heaven shake and cries of woo rise from all sides, and everyone mourns the loss of chastity and social morals. The problem here is that in our country, women have never been granted any rights. A woman has always been like an object that, after use, is thrown into a corner and forgotten. And women, due to the same spirit of weakness and despondency that exists in us, have never wanted to step out of their condition as merchandise and manifest their true identity. That's why the palace of men's arrogance and selfishness has reached the skies, and now they cannot tolerate it and believe that I am blasphemous, and they have torn the veil of shame and modesty and talked about things that are exclusively theirs and part of their eternal belongings. She is the most important poet of modern Iran, but I'm sure that most of you are not familiar with this introduction because it's not translated, it's not published, it doesn't circulate. And how important it is to read this today after the woman life freedom movement, right, in Iran, and how many new meanings we can find when comparing what was happening in Iran in Tehran in 1955 with what happens to date in Tehran in 2024. And she said, I want and am determined to remain a woman in my poetry. I'll never need to cover my face with a mask of chastity and purity in order to hide my inner features. To quote Khayyam, she was a fine knower of the classical tradition. She said, they say I worship wine. Yes, I do. They call me a corrupted drunkard. Yes, I am. Do not dwell on my outer appearance, for I truly am anything I hide inside. Those who want to slander me with these tactics should understand that poetry is a space that frees the artist from all external bonds. I did not devote myself to art and poetry out of amusement or folly. Poetry is my life, and what truly matters to me is the emotion of feeling alive. I do not want to surrender to the comfort of the soul and heart. My highest aspiration is to see my poetry become a manifestation of the beauty and pleasure that life can offer to human beings. We go back to what Jahan was saying, with a different language, with a different spiritual context, but the point is the same. To celebrate beauty, the beauty of being alive, connected with the invisible also. I want my poetry to explode with emotion and ardor. A woman has the right to be a woman in her poetry, too. And those who cannot accept this will have to wait for the day when, with the advancement of civilization and cultural progress, this right will be established for all Iranian women. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
I hear? Okay.
Should sit in the middle, yes,
Middle.
yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Domenico, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I am excited together with Mustafa to start our discussion here among the three of us first, and then we'll open it
to the audience.
to questions from the audience.
Should we go chronologically? Or?
Chronologically, it is. Sounds great. Then I guess I'll be starting.
I forgot, yes. Chronology.
No worries, we can go ahead.
Yes, absolutely, sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. All right. So I will be starting with some thoughts and questions about Jahan Malek Khatun. And it is very, I think we all felt that it was such an intriguing comparison between Jahan and Forugh as two women that kind of entered the Persian literary tradition in different ways. And I guess my first question that I'd like to think through with you is that both of them, as you alluded in your talk, also is they built on previous poetic works, also previous poetry by women. So in the case of Jahan Malek Khatun, for example, I'm wondering whether you could say a bit more about her predecessors, like other female poets, like she's mentioned some of them in her introduction, and the way that they navigated being in this male-dominated space of poetry, right? How did they fashion their lyrical eye? Did they also adopt a male voice in this homonormative space? And was Jahan aware of the different ways that they entered this space?
Thank you for this question. Yes, absolutely. No, she does outline the whole tradition of female poetry writing in Iran. She does not mention, she skips important names such as Mahsati Ganjavi for different reasons, also because there was a strong erotic component in Mahsati Ganjavi's poetry, or maybe because Mahsati Ganjavi never wrote poetry. This is a theory. But she's aware of these names, but it's clear to me that none of them, at least this was a perception, people like Padshah Khatun, for instance, Qotlok Shah Khatun, Aisha Mogharriya, and also these are the names that she lists, they were not devoted to poetry as a primary occupation. Poetry to them was not the main goal of their activities and endeavors. There was a spiritual component or a political component. It was important, but I think that she has the perception that she's the first one who is crossing a threshold, is accessing a threshold, and the amount of poems, of lines that she produces also speaks to what was the activity of her lifetime. Mm-hmm. So this is the main difference. And I think that it's always hard to talk about gender in Persian poetry because we're limited by our cultural biases, and the cultural biases are the language that we use and the aesthetic frameworks in which we operate. In theory, the object of desire in Persian poetry is genderless. There are reflections on the historical truth of male presences, so that's why by convention we say that the beloved is a male presence. So every time that gender comes up, there is a male presence, never a female presence, unless They're referring to Masnavi stories, for instance, of Shirin and Layli. In her case, I believe that she embraces the canon in a bold way, and she wants to be read and seen as someone who can compete with her male fellow poets, and she perceives that poets before her, women poets before her, had not been accepted by canon, or her voice was too feminine for the canon to be accepted. The question, it's very interesting, that very vulgar comment that Kamal Khoja Diobet Zakani makes about her poetry, saying that this poetry comes from a vagina, points directly to the problem there that Jahan Malek Khatun was feeling, that how can I separate my biological sex from the literary abstraction of a poetic persona, the maneshairi, right, in these poems, that has to be male, has to be part of the canon. Right? Good poetry in medieval Iran, it's a poetry that belongs to a canon, that creates a shared I, creates a shared persona, a shared negab shairi, as Iranian critics call it. So I think that there is this awareness of it from the...
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. This kind of almost professional aspiration of being recognized as a poet, and something that I noticed when you were reading from her introduction today actually was the word respectable, right? When she says, like, I have found some respectable female poets. I forget the exact way she said it, but suddenly I thought, like, oh, maybe she's really worried about being respectable, right? And maybe this is connected to her class and her social status as, an injured princess, that she needs to be respectable in some way. And I think that's kind of connected to my next question, which is about her introduction, where, I'm wondering, we kind of separate the historical author from the lyrical I, but we seem to accept that the voice in the introduction is her, right? And isn't that to some extent problematic, or we need to critically think about that? And I'm asking whether you have any thoughts on what she said in her introduction is something performative that she kind of had to say because of her position as a woman, because of her class, to kind of enter this male space, kind of performing femininity for them, which much goes into your argument of it being a self-defense as well, right?
This is a very good question, a difficult question, because when there is writing, there's always performance. When we write our journal and describe for ourselves what we did during the day, we're performing for ourselves, the sole spectators. So I think that I've been comparing her introduction to introduction written by authors such as Amir Khosrow Dehlavi or Khajuye Kermani, Saidi Shirazi himself. There is a feeling of more intimacy. There is an intimate voice that comes out. She really cares about what she's saying, and she's saying it in a way that feels more down to earth, if I can use this expression. There is less rhetorical performativity. So she's asking in a very clear way and saying, this is there is a tradition. This is what I try to do. This is the kind of poetry I write. I will not change the imagery of my poetry. It's up to the readers to make sense of it in a way that follows also the very first debates around the nature of erotic poetry in the context of Sufi mysticism in Islam. Al-Ghazali, for instance, who is one of the most important theologians of medieval Iran, has a whole chapter in the Kimya Sadat and also Ihya Ulum ad-Din, in which he tries to defend poetry and say, I know we are aware that this erotic poetry that comes from courtly environment, that is mundane, is circulating among Sufi circles. How can we interpret it? And he says poetry is like a mirror. Whatever you see in a mirror is the reflection of what you are. You cannot assume that the image that are found in a mirror are engraved, right, by the first person who polished that sheet of metal, of iron, right? Mirrors were not made of glass at the time, were sheets of metal. So there's this important hermeneutical, interpretive aspect, and she's being faithful to herself when she says, this is the eroticism, you need to accept it, and I'm telling you how to read it if you want to have no issues at my erotic poetry, right? She's suggesting it. And it's interesting because in her poetry is very conservative. Her poetry is much closer to the poetry of Sadi Shirazi, who flourished 1 century earlier, than to that of Hafez Shirazi. Hafez uses the language of mysticism, uses the language of tasawwuf, he uses the language of spiritual insight. Also, it's much more complex in politics. Talks about real wine, about mystical wine, but in her poetry there's no technical language that goes back to mysticism. So it's fascinating to see how a apparently purely erotic kind of poetry, its author is, right, inviting us to read it in a way only if we have issues with it. Mm-hmm. So it shows that poetry should not be deciphered in only one way, but can mean different things simultaneously, mainly depending on the attitude and the stances of the reader. So this is what she tries to do. So I think that if there is performance there, she's defiant, and she's saying this is yes, if you have an issue with it, it's your eyes.
On you. Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think, I don't know, there's almost a little bit of a crisis as a scholar that I'm experiencing when I'm reading her introduction. It was like, well, her poetry doesn't have any Sufi vocabulary, and yet she says, like, no, it's all majaz, right? It's so it's you think it's majaz, but actually it's spiritual, right? And what does that do with us scholars who are trying to read classical Persian poetry and kind of decide on what level do we think they operate? Like, is there any way for us to know?
We have to keep the ambivalence, and just think in terms of that. In that context, what the reader makes the experience as well. This is what Gadamer would have said a few decades ago, right? So it's in the West, this is a relatively modern concept of interpreting. This is the reader-focused, the reader-based interpretation of the text, instead of deciding that the author decides what the text means. But in this tradition, poetry is a constant performative act, and it can have different meanings in the ways that it was read and circulated. So the same text could mean something completely different in two different contexts, and the authors themselves are aware of it, I think.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'll pass the microphone to Mustafa now. Thank you very much.
I'll try to be shorter. Plus, unlike you, I don't have any notes, so I'm not as organized. I was on the plane when you were taking those notes. But I had the pleasure of actually taking a look at your article, and we also had a chance to briefly talk about it. Thank you so much. First of all, fantastic argument, the way you have made connections between these. Despite this huge gap, there is absolutely, because first, when you gave us the title, I was like, sounds interesting. Let's see what he does with it. But you've done a really good job. So going back to the issue of firsts and precedents, I should acknowledge actually your dear friend and colleague, Dr. Brookshaw's also attention to Jahan Malek Khatun, who I think it was through his works that I first became especially attentive to Jahan Malek Khatun, and at the time that we didn't have the pleasure of having Alexandra as our classical Persian specialist, and I would be teaching classical Persian poetry courses, so I ventured in, inserting one or two of her poems, and going back to the collective, the collection of her works, my attention was also drawn to the preface for similar reasons, which I will share with you. And it was like going back to Farzan Milani's, research on, especially on autobiography as a genre, and the rarity and scarcity of having autobiographical self-revelation in Perso-Islamic culture in general, not just among women, but also even among men. So much so that, for instance, even a memoir like A Stone on a Grave by Jalal al-Ahmad, in which he talks about his infertility, when it gets published posthumously, many of his friends feel ashamed that, well, this guy has revealed certain things about his infertility. Why should it get published, et cetera, et cetera. So going back to that preface, I admired it so much in terms of, now here with two experts, I would love us, and especially you, to help us with, could we, because I don't think whether Dr. Milani has, or maybe I have missed this, because when she talks about the scarcity of, again, autobiographical self-revelation, there is no mention of Jahan Malek Khatun. Could we read this as one instance of, as a matter of fact, sort of like, it has memoir-like aspects to it, when we add also elements that, for instance, Dr. Brookshaw has discovered in her poetry in terms of there are elements in her poetry that reveal her femininity. For instance, she uses imagery, or the poetic speaker in her collection that has, for instance, pots and pans in them. Like appliances in the kitchen, for instance, that normally a male poet or poetess speaker would probably be reluctant to use, right? So can we also see this as an instance of autobiographical eye in the, and probably also be encouraged to even discover more such instances, basically? I'm sorry, it was a long question, but
no,
I'm really fascinated by this aspect of her.
It's one of the main problems that we have when reading her poetry, trying to understand what filters through. And I think that her goal was not to let anything transpire or emerge that would take the reader back to her biological sex. I'm not sure about the few instances, maybe one or two, the most, instances in which there are references that could be read as feminine. She didn't really have experience. She was a princess, so she was not preparing meals, for sure. We know this, right? She had Mongol also origins.
Sure.
There is an interesting element, I don't know how to read it, the presence of blood, the way she mentions the word khun, rizi, and it's constant, and there are waves of blood in her poetry, much more than, I haven't done a statistical comparison, but blood appears in a much more impressive way in her poetry. So
in a way that you don't see that normally in
no. So I don't. It would be interesting to think in medical terms, and how the presence of blood was described in medical treatises, for instance, in other non-literary documents, whether there is an association between femininity and blood in ways that sound almost naive, right, today, because it seems obvious, but, I don't want to, just issue biased.
No, sure. And I want to actually leave some sort of, time for the audience as well, but just very quickly, so the very courage to overcome even the shame of, and we read about how, for instance, she was subject and forced even to subjected to the shaming process of other male poets, right? So even just overcoming that shame and talking about your own self, I really find it something to be sort of paid even more and more attention to. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Wonderful. Maybe we can open it up to
yes.
the audience's questions. I'm sure your talk has triggered a lot of questions. Yes. I guess we have one microphone over there.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, in your research, have you found any influence of Rabi' Balkhi, the other Persian or Persian, Iranian, Afghan, anyway, background, who wrote Persian poems? I'm wondering if Jahan has been influenced by Rabi', and comparing Rabi' to Jahan, how was the, in this concept or in genre of love poems or erotic poems, as you mentioned, has Rabi' because Rabi' has lots of love poems as well. How do you compare anyway this? Thank you.
Rabais is not really mentioned until very late in the tradition, and there are some scholars such as François de Blois who think that Rabais never really wrote poetry either, like Masati Ganjavi. So it's a question mark. So it is very hard to determine whether Rabais' poetry was written by a man or a woman. And for sure, Jahan doesn't mention her name, but at the same time, we don't really know whether she had access to her poetry for different reasons, right? The most extreme would be that there was none, right? It was just a story that was circulating and that attributed. There are some scholars who deny the fact that Omar Khayyam ever wrote any rubaiyat. So it's an interesting question. It's
Not
like,
to mention that Omar Khayyam himself and his poetry ascribed to, given that I had the pleasure of writing my MA thesis about, and so we came to the conclusion that perhaps Khayyamate or Khayyamik
was a trend, right, in which it's possible.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, right? So it will be interesting to compare all the fragments and see how they were received, if there are traces of that. As far as I understand, and as far as I don't see any reflection on that. And her ghazals are very classically formed, and she mentions Sadi. The only two poets she mentions in her poetry are Sadi and Nizami. In the ghazals themselves, but that's it. So
doesn't she mention Rabais in the preface? And I'm trying to give
another Rabais.
Another Rabais.
Yes,
Okay, wonderful. Navino.
Thank you, Domenico, for that beautiful talk and for the conversation that followed. I was struck by what Jahan Malek Khatun said in the beginning in her preface about not knowing that her work was not circulating, her erotic poetry was not circulating, and then sort of then prefacing, using that to preface her remarks on this tradition of poetry, women writing poetry. And I was struck by the fact that the idea of circulation and the utterance of poetry is so central to the idea that the poetry exists only as far as it is circulated. And without that, these conversations are not happening publicly, broadly. And as I'm reading, or as you read some of the comments, not comments, but the remarks that Forugh Farrokhzad makes in her introduction, and I love the comparison between the two introductions that you drew. I guess I had a very facile question, which is that are they actually maybe thinking about a stylistics, a form of poetry that is above or outside this tradition at all? Or do they firmly locate themselves within the traditions that they are? Do they see themselves as forging something new and in conversation with other women? Or is this just, is circulation amongst men and amongst the broader public essential to the existence of the poet and the poetry? And I guess this is very much along the lines of what Alexandra was saying about the lyrical eye and then the eye of the preface. Thank you.
Their poetry is very conservative when it comes to form, in both cases. Jahan feels like a 13th century poet more than a 14th century poet. Farrokhzad looks like an early Nimaist poet. She was influenced by Nima Yushij, but she's a gradualist. Farshad Somboldel published a beautiful book recently, The Rebellion of Forms, about avant-garde in modern Persian poetry. And he says that there's an initial phase called the gradualist modernism, the very first decade of Nima Yushij, Afsaneh, for instance, and then poets like Khan Lari through the magazine Sokhan, even Feridun Tavalali. Initially, they were embracing this first phase, and then there is a second phase of high modernism, more experimental modernism, that Farrokhzad adopted only after her third collection, probably with Ossian or Essian, and then of course Tableau de Digar, so it is important. So I think that they had to adopt these more traditional forms, or the Chahar Pareh in her case, Farrokhzad never wrote blank verse, really. There is always meter, there is always aruz in her poetry. But especially in the first collection, there is rhyme, there's always a rhyme, there's always the meter that is respected and followed throughout the poem. So this was the way for them to be accepted, as to be taken seriously. So the more the content of their poetry, or their presence in the canon was problematic, was perceived to be problematic, the more they had to keep a very tight connection to the tradition, to the formal tradition. So I see that, to be honest. Thank you. You have a question? Yeah, behind you.
Yeah,
Nadina.
sure. I know there might be many questions. Maybe we can take one more question. Then of course, we would encourage everyone to probably extend the conversation over the reception afterward. If that is okay?
Hi, thank you so much. This was very eye-opening for me as well, at least. One question though, you talked about, you opened up by describing Jahan Malek Khatun as a princess. And it comes it makes me think about another princess some 300 years later, and that was Zibun Nisa. And there are some similarities in a sense that being a princess did not bring them immunity from criticism, and in the case of Zibun Nisa, she was imprisoned by her own father. But it seems that she did not have that kind of challenge talking about love, at least in her own poetry. I don't know, I'm not sure if she was aware of Jahan Malek Khatun's work at all, but I'm kind of wondering how do you compare these two in similarities, differences, and whatnot?
I think Jahan Malek Khatun was a model for the poets of that time, especially during the Safavid and Timurid for sure. Safavid early Qajar period, her poetry was circulating. In India, it was circulating. It was very interesting. The status as an aristocrat, a member of an aristocratic society, it's something that goes back to the relative freedom that Mongol women had and what they brought to Iranian society. So we see Padshah Khatun, for instance, is the first princess who composes a poetry and talks about her presence as a princess, as a ruler, and as a poet. So and I think that was the first. There were the first 2 or 3 generations of poets who were somehow taking advantage of their position as aristocrats and doing that. And their name was circulating. So it became, of course, a source of inspiration for later poets. There are anthologists from the late Timurid period who mention Jahan. And there are a couple, there is one manuscript that I found that is in Paris in which a poet whose takhalo is Nachiz, and we see in the manuscript there is the divan, Jahan's divan, and then there is this 20 or 30 ghazals by this Nachiz, who was influenced by, surely a Timurid poet who was influenced by Jahan Malek Khatun and so on. There was a tradition that was established. Thank you. We had one question here.
Sure.
Sorry. She was the first
and
one.
I'll pass this to Alexandra, because I know that the final remarks will come from Alexandra.
Here in the front.
Can feel my heartbeat. I got goosebumps. I do appreciate your knowledge, the long way that you came to be here. I do appreciate it. You're trying to show the positive side of my motherland and our literature. So I really want to know what really motivated you for the first time to become closer to Persian literature and Farsi.
The connection between censorship and artistic creativity. I was a teenager in Italy, and I read about photographers such as Shadi Ghadirian, and to me it was so fascinating to see that despite all cultural and political limitations and hardship, there were so many young artists who were trying to say something, right, and trying to really be seen, and then that was my initial interest, and then I discovered the classical canon and long story. But it was mostly visual, contemporary visual culture.
All right. Thank you very much to the audience for their questions. I will just be closing our event for today, and I'm sure Domenico will be able to answer some more questions outside at the reception. And I'm just gonna close. Okay, that's a lot. There we go. Apologies for going through the rest of your slides. Okay, so just as a way of closing this event, we would love to hear your feedback on this session. We have a short survey that you can access through this QR code. And we'll also be sharing the link over email through your registration email addresses. And I just wanted to say again that, thank you so much for coming, Domenico. It was truly a pleasure. It's, as Mustafa already alluded to, it's the last event of the 2023-24 Ahmadian lecture series. And just looking ahead to next year, we are also happy to announce that the team of organizers is growing, and we are happy to have Dr. Navina Naqvi join us as co-organizer next year. She is the assistant professor of Persianate Islamic cultures of South Asia in the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. And her current research explores Persianate reflections on early colonial rule in India, and her broader interests include Afghan history and the history of Persianate music. So we're very excited to broaden our interests and our future lecture series as well. So with that, I thank everyone very much for coming. There is a small reception outside, so please stay a while and have a snack or two, and we look forward to talking to you more there. Thank you very much.